A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at some crime statistics this morning, and I realized something pretty counterintuitive. In almost every jurisdiction where they tighten the screws on the sex trade with the intention of stopping exploitation, the actual reports of violence against the workers go up, not down. It is what researchers call the Prohibition paradox. It is the idea that the more you try to protect a population through criminalization, the more you actually isolate them from the very legal protections that are supposed to keep them safe.
Herman Poppleberry here. That paradox is the central tension in every legislative session on this topic. You have this clash between the noble intent of ending exploitation and the messy, dangerous reality of how these markets actually function when you push them into the shadows. We are talking about a fundamental disconnect between the moral goal of a law and the mechanical outcome of that law. As of today, March 22nd, 2026, we are seeing this play out in real time across the globe as different nations experiment with wildly different regulatory philosophies.
Well, today's prompt from Daniel is about exactly that. He wants us to look at the global landscape of sex work regulation, specifically contrasting the different models like the Nordic model, full legalization, and decriminalization. He also pointed out that Israel has recently made a major legislative pivot here, which is a perfect case study for this tension. We have touched on the darker side of this in our previous episodes on trafficking, but today we are looking at the legal architecture that sits on top of it all.
It is a massive topic, Corn. To really understand it, we have to look at the four distinct archetypes of regulation that countries choose from. You have outright prohibition, which is what most people in the United States are familiar with. Then you have the Nordic model, which Israel recently adopted. Then there is full legalization, like you see in parts of Germany or the Netherlands. And finally, there is full decriminalization, which is the New Zealand approach. Each of these models is built on a different philosophical assumption about what sex work actually is. Is it a crime, a sin, a form of violence, a business, or a labor right?
Before we dive into the specific countries, we should probably clear up the vocabulary. I think a lot of people use legalization and decriminalization as if they mean the same thing, but in policy circles, they are worlds apart. If you get those two mixed up, you are going to misunderstand the entire debate.
They are fundamentally different frameworks. Legalization means the state creates a specific, highly regulated industry. It is like the tobacco or alcohol industry. The government says who can work, where they can work, and they usually require health checks, licensing, and specific zoning. If you operate outside those specific state-mandated lines, you are still a criminal. It is essentially controlled permission.
Right. So it is a state-controlled market. Decriminalization, on the other hand, is more about removing the specific criminal penalties for the act itself and treating the work under existing labor laws. It is not about creating a special box for it. It is about saying that if two consenting adults are involved, the police do not have a seat at the table unless there is a crime like assault or theft. It treats the industry like any other service sector, like massage therapy or personal training, governed by standard occupational health and safety rules.
That distinction is vital because it changes who has the power. In a legalization model, the state and the brothel owners often hold all the cards because the regulations are so expensive to comply with. In a decriminalization model, the individual worker theoretically has the same labor rights as a barista or an office worker. They can sue for unpaid wages or report a safety violation without admitting to a crime.
Let us start with the model that is currently gaining the most momentum in the West, which is the Nordic model. This is what Sweden started back in 1999, and it is what Daniel mentioned regarding Israel's recent shift. The logic there is that you do not arrest the person selling the service, you arrest the person buying it. It is often called the abolitionist model, because its ultimate goal is to make the industry disappear by making it impossible to be a customer.
The technical term is demand-side criminalization. The philosophical backbone of this model is the idea that the sex trade is inherently exploitative and a form of violence against women. Therefore, the state's goal should be to abolish the market entirely by starving it of customers. If you make it too risky or expensive for the buyer, the demand dries up and the industry disappears. It treats the worker as a victim who needs exiting services rather than a criminal who needs a jail cell.
That sounds great on paper, especially from a conservative or a feminist perspective of protecting the vulnerable. But what does the data actually say about what happens to the workers when the buyers are being hunted by the police? Because if the demand does not actually go to zero, the market just changes shape, right?
This is where the friction starts. When you criminalize the buyer, the transaction has to happen much faster and in more secluded locations. In Sweden, researchers found that workers had less time to screen clients. If a buyer is worried about a police sting, he is not going to stand under a street lamp and show his identification or talk for 10 minutes to establish trust. He wants the worker in the car and out of sight immediately. This effectively strips the worker of their most important safety tool, the vibe check or the pre-screening process.
So the safety screening process, which is the worker's primary defense against violence, gets bypassed. It is like trying to vet a roommate while a SWAT team is counting down from 10. You are going to make bad choices because you are rushed. And if the worker is seen as a victim by the law, but their source of income is criminalized, they are still living in a world of criminality.
And that is the Israel connection. Israel passed the Prohibition of Consumption of Prostitution Services law in late 2018, and it came into full effect in July of 2020. It was a massive shift for a country that previously had a more hands-off approach. Before that, the act of buying or selling was not technically a criminal offense in Israel, though keeping a brothel was. Now, a first-time buyer faces a fine of 2,000 shekels, which is about $550. If they do it again within 3 years, the fine doubles to 4,000 shekels. They can even be prosecuted criminally in certain cases.
I remember the debate in the Knesset over this. There was a lot of focus on the rehabilitation aspect. The Israeli government set aside roughly 90 million shekels for programs to help people exit the industry, things like vocational training, therapy, and housing support. But we are now in 2026. We have had over 5 years of this law being in effect. Has it actually reduced the size of the market, or has it just moved it onto encrypted apps?
The evidence, including the recent 2025 evaluation reports from Israeli NGOs and academic researchers, suggests a massive migration to the digital space. When you make the street-level transaction a liability, the market does not vanish, it just goes underground. In Israel, the police reported a significant drop in visible street prostitution in places like South Tel Aviv, which politicians pointed to as a success. But advocacy groups working on the ground, like the Red Umbrella Project, reported that the same workers were now more isolated, working out of private apartments or through Telegram bots where the police have a much harder time monitoring for actual trafficking or abuse.
This brings us back to that human trafficking angle we discussed in episode 147. The goal of the Nordic model is to stop trafficking by killing the market. But if the market just goes dark, do not the traffickers actually get more power? If a worker is now a legal pariah because their place of work is an illegal den, they are much less likely to call the police when a trafficker shows up.
That is the primary criticism from organizations like Amnesty International and the World Health Organization. They argue that the Nordic model, despite its good intentions, creates a barrier between the worker and the state. If your client is a criminal, and your landlord is technically a pimp because they are renting to you for the purpose of sex work, you are living in a world of criminals. You are not going to call the cops to report a stolen phone or a physical threat if it means exposing your entire survival network to prosecution. In Israel, some workers have reported that clients now use the law as a weapon, threatening to call the police on themselves just to get the worker in trouble or to extort them for lower prices.
It is a tough needle to thread. If you are pro-Israel and you care about the moral fabric of the country, you want to see these exploitative industries gone. But if the law intended to protect women actually makes them more vulnerable to the very traffickers we want to stop, we have to be honest about that outcome. It is a classic case of the unintended consequence.
Let us look at the opposite end of the spectrum, full legalization. This is the Germany and Netherlands approach. In Germany, they passed the Prostitute Protection Act, the Prostituiertenschutzgesetz, in 2017. It sounds very supportive, but in practice, it is incredibly bureaucratic. Workers have to register with the local government, they have to carry a registration card, and they have to attend mandatory health counseling.
I can see why a nerdy guy like you would like the idea of a registration card, Herman. But for someone trying to keep their private life separate from their professional life, that sounds like a nightmare. Imagine having to tell a government official your stage name and your real name just to be allowed to work.
It is a huge barrier to entry. Only a small fraction of the estimated 200,000 to 400,000 sex workers in Germany have actually registered. Most workers, especially those who are migrants from Eastern Europe or who have families who do not know what they do for a living, refuse to put their names on a government list. So what happens? They continue to work, but now they are working illegally within a legal system. This creates a two-tiered market.
So you end up with a gold standard tier of big, flashy, tax-paying brothels that the government can point to as a success. And then you have a massive, unregulated shadow market where all the actual abuse happens. And because the legal side exists, the government can claim they have solved the problem, while the most vulnerable people are pushed even further into the margins.
And the administrative burden is high. Brothel owners in Germany have to meet strict building codes, provide social security contributions for employees, and maintain rigorous hygiene standards. While that sounds good, it drives up the cost of doing business. This often pushes the lower income workers back into the unregulated sector because they cannot afford the overhead of the legal brothels. It effectively corporatizes the industry, giving power to big business owners rather than the individual workers.
What about the trafficking rates in Germany? I have seen conflicting reports. Some say legalization made Germany the brothel of Europe and increased trafficking, while others say it just made the trafficking more visible so it could be stopped.
The data is incredibly messy because of how countries define trafficking. In a legal system, you have more inspectors and more police interaction with the legitimate businesses, so you might uncover more cases. However, a study by the London School of Economics suggested that legalized markets can actually lead to an increase in human trafficking because the legal industry creates a shield. If you have a massive legal brothel, it is much easier to hide a few trafficked individuals among the hundreds of legal workers than it is to hide them in a country where the whole thing is banned. The sheer volume of the legal market can overwhelm the inspectors.
That is a terrifying thought. The legal infrastructure becomes a camouflage for the illegal activity. It is the opposite of what you would expect. It is like trying to find a needle in a needle factory.
Now compare that to the New Zealand model, which is full decriminalization. They passed the Prostitution Reform Act in 2003. Instead of creating a new set of prostitution laws or a special sex work police, they simply said that the industry would be governed by the same health, safety, and employment laws as any other business. If a brothel owner mistreats a worker, they are violating labor law, not just a moral code.
This is the one that groups like Human Rights Watch and the Lancet Medical Journal always point to as the gold standard for harm reduction. Why is it different from the German model? Why does removing the special regulations help?
The key is worker autonomy. In New Zealand, small groups of up to 4 people can work together in a private apartment without needing a brothel license. This is called a small owner-operated brothel or an SOUB. This allows workers to bypass the pimp or the big corporate brothel owner entirely. They keep all their earnings, they control their own hours, and they look out for each other. Because they are not breaking the law, they have a remarkably high level of trust with the police.
I read a study from the University of Otago that said over 60% of sex workers in New Zealand felt the law gave them more power to refuse specific clients or certain practices. That seems like the most direct metric of safety there is. If you can say no to a client who refuses to use a condom or who seems aggressive without fearing you will be arrested or fired, you are inherently safer.
The police in New Zealand actually have a dedicated liaison for the sex industry. Their job is not to arrest the workers or the clients, but to ensure that labor laws are being followed and that no one is being coerced. It turns the police from an adversary into a service provider. The reporting of violence actually went up after decriminalization, but the researchers concluded it was not because there was more violence, but because workers finally felt safe enough to report it. They knew the police would take them seriously rather than arresting them for being at the scene of the crime.
That is a crucial distinction. Higher crime stats can sometimes mean a more effective system, not a more dangerous one. If people are coming out of the shadows to report crimes, that is a win for the rule of law. It means the dark figure of unreported crime is shrinking.
But we have to look at the scale. New Zealand is a small, isolated island nation with a high level of social trust and a relatively small population. Could you port that model to a place like the United States or a major European transit hub? In New Zealand, they have very strict border controls, which makes it much harder for international trafficking rings to operate. In a place like Germany or the United States, the sheer volume of people moving across borders makes the New Zealand model much harder to manage without a massive increase in labor inspectors.
That is a fair point. Policy does not exist in a vacuum. What works in Wellington might not work in Las Vegas or Tel Aviv. Speaking of the United States, we are largely still in the Prohibition camp, except for a few licensed counties in Nevada. What are the consequences of the outright ban model? Because that is still the global default in many places.
Prohibition is the most dangerous model for the worker, hands down. When both the buyer and the seller are criminals, the entire industry is controlled by organized crime. There is zero recourse for violence. If a worker is robbed or beaten, they know that calling the police will likely result in their own arrest. It also creates a massive public health risk. In prohibited markets, the rates of sexually transmitted infections are significantly higher because there is no mechanism for mandatory or even encouraged testing. Condoms are sometimes even used by police as evidence of intent to commit a crime, which discourages workers from carrying them.
And from a conservative standpoint, prohibition is also incredibly expensive. We spend billions of dollars on police hours, court time, and jail space for what is essentially a consensual transaction between adults, while the actual violent predators, the rapists and the traffickers, are often overlooked because the police are busy doing undercover stings on street corners to catch Johns.
It is an allocation of resources issue. If you are a pro-Trump, law and order type of person, you have to ask, do I want my police officers spending their night trying to catch a guy paying for a date, or do I want them tracking down the cartels and the actual traffickers who are kidnapping people? Prohibition forces the police to treat the victim and the criminal as one and the same, which muddies the water for actual investigations.
Let us circle back to Israel's shift toward the Nordic model. The proponents argued that by criminalizing the buyer, they were sending a moral message that women's bodies are not for sale. That is a powerful cultural statement in a country with a strong religious and social identity. But if the second-order effect is that those women are now working in more dangerous, isolated conditions, is the moral message worth the physical cost?
That is the debate currently raging in the Israeli academic and legal community. The law included a 5-year evaluation period where the government has to track the outcomes. We're coming up on the finalization of that mark now in early 2026. Preliminary reports show that while the demand might have decreased slightly in visible areas, the vulnerability of the remaining workers has spiked. There is also the issue of the displacement effect.
Meaning the market just moves somewhere else? Like a game of whack-a-mole?
Or rather, it moves into different forms. We are seeing a massive rise in what people call sugar dating or arrangement sites. Because these platforms frame the relationship as a mutually beneficial arrangement rather than a direct transaction for sex, they often fall into a legal gray area. The Nordic model has a very hard time regulating digital platforms. In Israel, the rise of Telegram as a marketplace for everything from drugs to sex work has made the 2020 law look increasingly like an analog solution to a digital problem.
This is where Daniel's point about technology comes in. With the rise of platforms like OnlyFans or private streaming sites, the traditional definition of prostitution is breaking down. If a person in Tel Aviv is getting paid by a person in New York to perform on a webcam, which country's laws apply? If the Nordic model is about stopping the consumption of the service, is it illegal for an Israeli to subscribe to an OnlyFans account?
The law is struggling to keep up. Most of these demand-side laws were written with streetwalking or brothels in mind. They are not equipped for a world where the transaction is decentralized and digital. In fact, many people argue that the digitalization of the industry is a form of harm reduction. If a worker can make a living from their living room without ever having to meet a stranger in a dark alley, they are objectively safer. But the Nordic model often treats even this digital work as part of the exploitative system that needs to be dismantled.
But even there, you have the risk of digital trafficking, coerced content creation. It just changes the nature of the oversight needed. Instead of beat cops, you need cybersecurity experts and financial investigators who can track where the money is going.
The common thread across all these models is that the more you marginalize the worker, the more power you give to the predator. Whether it is the state through overregulation in Germany or the pimp through prohibition in the United States, the loser is always the person at the center of the transaction. The New Zealand model succeeds because it centers the worker's agency. It says, "We might not like what you do, but we will protect your right to do it safely."
So if we look at the evidence-based consensus, where does it land? If a government wanted to prioritize safety and public health above moral messaging, which model has the strongest data behind it?
Most major international bodies, including the United Nations, Amnesty International, and the World Health Organization, have moved toward supporting decriminalization. The data from New Zealand is the most consistently positive in terms of health outcomes, worker safety, and reporting of crimes. The Nordic model is the most popular politically because it feels like a middle ground. It satisfies the moral desire to punish the buyer while appearing to protect the seller. But the actual outcomes for the sellers are often quite grim, leading to increased poverty and police harassment.
It is the classic trap of doing something that makes you feel good but makes the problem worse. It is the same logic as some of the failed drug war policies. You want to stop the drug, so you arrest the user, but you just end up with more potent drugs and more violent cartels. In the sex trade, you want to stop the consumption, so you arrest the buyer, but you just end up with more desperate workers and more empowered traffickers.
And we have to be honest about the trafficking numbers. One of the biggest misconceptions is that the majority of people in the sex trade are trafficked. While trafficking is a horrific reality that we must fight, and we talked about the mechanics of that in episode 147, the vast majority of people in the industry globally are there for economic reasons. When you treat the entire industry as trafficking, by default, as the Nordic model does, you lose the ability to distinguish between a consenting adult making a living and a victim who needs rescue.
That is a huge point. If the police treat everyone as a victim, they often end up rescuing people who do not want to be rescued, which wastes resources and breeds resentment. It makes the actual victims harder to find because they are buried in a sea of people who are just trying to hide from the help. It is a waste of the very resources that should be going toward dismantling actual slave labor rings.
There was a case in Israel shortly after the new law passed where a group of workers protested outside the Knesset. Their message was, "You are taking away our livelihood in the name of saving us, but you have not provided a viable economic alternative." If the government provides 2,000 shekels in rehabilitation, but the worker was making 10,000 shekels a month to support their family, the math just does not work. They will go back to the industry, but they will do it in a way that is harder for the government to see, which makes them more vulnerable to the next predator.
It is about economic reality. You cannot legislate away poverty or the demand for human connection. You can only change the conditions under which those two things meet. If you ignore the economics, you are just moving the problem around.
So, what are the practical takeaways for someone looking at this from a policy perspective? First, legalization is not a silver bullet. If the regulations are too burdensome or expensive, you just create a black market. Second, the Nordic model needs to be judged by its impact on worker safety, not just its impact on moral messaging. And third, decriminalization seems to offer the best balance of safety and autonomy, but it requires a high-functioning, non-corrupt police force and a robust social safety net to work.
It also requires a society that is willing to accept that this industry exists and always will. That is a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people, especially in more traditional or religious societies. But as we see in Israel, even a country with a strong moral core has to grapple with the reality that prohibition often creates more suffering than it prevents. The prohibition paradox is real, and it has a human cost.
I think we are going to see a lot of movement on this in the next decade as the OnlyFans generation comes into political power. The idea of the state regulating what two people do with their bodies and their money is becoming increasingly unpopular across the political spectrum, from libertarians on the right to civil libertarians on the left. The focus is shifting from how do we stop this to how do we make this safe.
It is an interesting alignment. You have the my body, my choice crowd meeting the get the government out of my business crowd. It is a rare moment of overlap in our polarized world.
What I find fascinating is how the data on public health outcomes is so clear. In New Zealand, the rates of HIV among sex workers are among the lowest in the world, and there has not been a recorded case of worker-to-client transmission in years. When people can access healthcare without fear of being arrested, everyone is safer. That is a conservative win for public health and fiscal responsibility. It is a pragmatic approach that saves lives and money.
It is about being pragmatic. You might not like the industry, but you should like the idea of fewer people getting sick and fewer people being murdered. If a policy makes the most vulnerable people safer, that is a policy worth considering, regardless of your moral stance on the work itself.
The debate is far from over. Countries like France and Canada followed the Nordic path recently, and they are seeing many of the same issues as Israel increased isolation and violence. Meanwhile, places like Belgium have moved toward decriminalization. We are essentially running a massive global social experiment right now, and the results are coming in.
And the stakes are as high as they get. We are talking about the lives and safety of some of the most marginalized people in our society. Daniel's prompt really pushed us into a corner here, but it is a corner that needs more light. We have to be willing to look at the data, even when it challenges our moral assumptions.
It is also a reminder that when we talk about human trafficking, we have to be precise. Conflating all sex work with trafficking is a gift to the actual traffickers. It hides them in plain sight and makes it harder for law enforcement to find the people who are truly being held against their will.
Well, this has been a heavy one, but a necessary one. If you want to dig deeper into the trafficking side of this, definitely check out episode 147 in our archive. It provides the other half of this picture, looking at the mechanics of coercion and how those networks operate.
For those who want to see the specific data on the New Zealand or German models, we will have links to the longitudinal studies on the website. It is worth looking at the numbers yourself rather than relying on the headlines. The University of Otago study and the German Ministry of Family Affairs reports are particularly enlightening.
Big thanks to our producer Hilbert Flemingtop for keeping us on track today, and a huge thank you to Medal for providing the GPU credits that keep this show running. Their support allows us to dive into these deep technical and policy topics every week.
This has been My Weird Props. If you are enjoying the deep dives, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It actually makes a huge difference in helping other people find the show and keeps us high in the rankings.
You can find all our episodes and join the conversation at myweirdprompts.com. We will be back next time with another of Daniel's prompts.
Until then, stay curious.
See ya!
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show.